The great dome of Nexus Prime stretched across the void of space like a crown made of living starlight, and within its crystalline walls, the most powerful beings in the galaxy had gathered to deliver their judgment upon humanity. Ambassador Thelvan of the Kovathi hegemony stood at the central podium, his body made of shifting blue crystals that caught the light of 1,000 distant suns. And in his hands he held a tablet containing the fate of an entire species. 347 alien civilizations filled the circular chamber, each one occupying seats that had been designed for their unique bodies. And together, they represented more than 50,000 years of galactic history, conquest, and cooperation. The human delegation stood at the bottom of the chamber, looking up at the endless rows of alien faces that stared down at them with expressions ranging from boredom to open contempt. Ambassador Sarah Chun wore her finest diplomatic uniform, the deep blue fabric pressed and perfect, and beside her stood a team of 12 specialists who had spent their entire careers preparing for this single moment. They had rehearsed their speeches 1,000 times, had studied every protocol and custom of every species in the council, and had believed with all their hearts that today would be the day humanity finally took its place among the stars. Talvan raised one crystalline hand and the chamber fell silent in an instant. For when the Kovathi spoke, the galaxy listened. The petition submitted by the species known as humanity, originating from the planet designated Earth in the outer spiral arm, has been reviewed by all appropriate committees and subcommittees of this council, he announced, his voice echoing through translation devices in hundreds of languages. Sarah Chun felt her heart beating faster as she watched the alien ambassador, and she squeezed the hand of her colleague Dr. James Wright, who had spent 30 years studying alien cultures just for this opportunity. After careful consideration of all relevant factors, including technological development, territorial holdings, cultural contributions, and historical conduct, the Galactic Council has reached a unanimous decision. Thelvan continued. The chamber seemed to hold its breath, and Sarah allowed herself a small moment of hope, thinking of her daughter back on Earth who had drawn pictures of alien friends she hoped to make someday. The petition is denied, Thelvan said simply, and the words hit the human delegation like a physical blow. Sarah felt the floor shift beneath her feet as the meaning of those 3 words sank into her mind, and around her she could hear gasps and whispered curses from her team. The reasons for this denial are as follows. Thelvan continued without any emotion in his crystalline voice. First, humanity is too young a species, having achieved faster than light travel only 47 standard years ago, while the minimum typical period for consideration is 500 years. Laughter rippled through sections of the chamber, and Sarah saw tentacle beings from the Marathi Consortium pointing at the humans and making sounds that needed no translation. Second, humanity's history demonstrates an unacceptable level of internal violence, including multiple global conflicts, weapons of mass destruction, and ongoing territorial disputes, even at the time of this petition. Thelvan read from his tablet. Third, human territorial holdings consist of a single star system with limited resources and no strategic value to council interests. Each reason was another knife in Sarah's heart, and she watched as her colleagues' faces fell from hope to despair to something approaching shame. Fourth, and finally, humanity has demonstrated no unique cultural, scientific, or economic contribution that would benefit the Council or its member species. Thelvan concluded, this petition may be resubmitted in no less than 200 standard years, at which time it will be reviewed according to standard protocols. He set down his tablet and looked directly at the human delegation with eyes that glowed like blue fire. The human delegation is thanked for its attendance and may now depart. Nexus Prime at its convenience, he said, and then simply turned away as if the humans had already ceased to exist. Chamber erupted into conversation as delegates from dozens of species began discussing trade agreements and border disputes, moving on to the next item on their agenda without a second thought for the small group of humans standing forgotten at the bottom of the hall. Sarah Chun stood frozen in place as she watched the galaxy continue without them, and she felt tears forming in her eyes that she refused to let fall in front of these creatures who had just dismissed her entire species as unworthy. Dr. Wright put a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "We should go, Sarah. There is nothing more we can do here." The walk back to the human shuttle was the longest of Sarah's life, and she could feel alien eyes watching them as they passed through corridors of gleaming metal and organic architecture. Could hear the clicks and whistles and hums that she knew were comments about the rejected humans when they finally reached their ship and the airlock sealed behind them. Sarah allowed herself to collapse into a seat and bury her face in her hands. 12 hours later, the delegation arrived back on Earth to face a world that had been watching the entire proceeding through broadcast satellites. The United Nations Emergency Council had already convened in the massive underground chamber beneath New Geneva, and representatives from every nation on Earth sat in tense silence as Sarah Chun delivered her report. "They see us as children," she said, her voice raw from hours of tears she had finally allowed herself to shed. "They see our wars and our weapons, and they think they know everything about us. And they have decided we are not worth their time or attention." The chamber exploded into argument as leaders from different nations blamed each other. Blamed the delegation, blamed the aliens, blamed everyone except themselves. Some called for military action, building fleets that could force the council to respect humanity, while others demanded complete isolation from a galaxy that had rejected them. Hours passed and no consensus emerged. Only more anger and more fear and more despair. Then a door at the back of the chamber opened and a woman walked in who had not been invited to this meeting. A woman with gray hair and sharp eyes who moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen too much to be impressed by shouting politicians. Director Elena Vasquez of the Terran Diplomatic Corps had built her career on solving impossible problems, and she had been watching this meeting from her office with growing frustration. "If I may," she said, and something in her voice made the chamber fall silent. She walked to the central podium and looked around at the frightened, angry faces of Earth's leaders. "You are all asking the wrong question," she said. "You are asking how we can force them to give us what we want or how we can survive without them. But those are the questions of a species that has already accepted defeat." The Russian delegate started to object, but Elena raised a hand to stop him. "The council expects us to either rage impotently or crawl away in shame, because that is what young species always do when they are rejected. And that is exactly why we must do neither." She pulled up a holographic display showing Nexus Prime and the endless web of trade routes and political alliances that connected the galaxy. "They denied us a seat at their table. So I propose we stop asking for one," Elena said. "Instead, we send a single envoy, one human with no fleet and no weapons and no demands, who will simply observe and wait." The American delegate laughed harshly and asked what possible good that could do. Elena smiled for the first time since the rejection, and there was something dangerous in that smile. "They think they know what humanity is," she said. "They have read our history and seen our worst moments and decided that is all we are. That they have never actually met us, never spent time with us, never seen what we do when no one is watching." She turned to face Sarah Chun directly and asked, "Ambassador, when you were on Nexus Prime, did any of them speak to you as an equal? Did any of them ask about your family or your hopes or your fears?" Sarah shook her head slowly, remembering how the aliens had looked through her as if she were furniture. "Then that is their weakness," Elena said. "They have built an empire of treaties and trade and power, but they have forgotten something the humans have never forgotten. Something that we learned through all those centuries of war and suffering that they hold against us. She paused and looked around the room at the leaders who were now listening with growing interest. We learned that connection is more powerful than conquest. That one person who truly cares can change more than 1,000 soldiers. And that the greatest strength is not the ability to destroy, but the willingness to help. The chamber was completely silent as Elena Vasquez laid out her plan. And by the time she finished, even the most skeptical delegates were nodding slowly. They would send one human to Nexus Prime, not as an ambassador demanding respect, but as an observer asking for nothing, and they would wait for the galaxy to discover what humanity really was. The Council had granted permission almost immediately. Amused by the pathetic gesture from the rejected species, they had no idea what they had invited into their midst. No idea that a single human would soon teach them lessons they had forgotten. Millennia ago, the selection process took 3 months. And in the end, they chose a man named Marcus Cole, a former teacher who had become a soldier, and then a diplomat, a man who had seen the worst of humanity. Marcus Cole stepped off his small shuttle onto the gleaming floor of Nexus Prime's docking bay, and he took a deep breath of air that smelled faintly of ozone and something like cinnamon. The station was even more impressive than the broadcasts had shown, with walls that seemed to be made of living crystal and lights that moved like swimming fish through the transparent ceilings. Above, a single Kovathi official waited for him, standing stiffly with a tablet in hand and an expression of barely concealed boredom on its faceted face. Human observer Marcus Cole. The official said flatly, "You have been assigned quarters in Section Gamma 7, which is the observation deck for non-member species, and you will be permitted to witness council proceedings from the designated viewing area." Marcus smiled warmly and extended his hand in the human gesture of greeting. But the Kovathi simply stared at it without moving. "Thank you for meeting me personally," Marcus said, lowering his hand without any sign of embarrassment. "I know you must be very busy, and I appreciate you taking the time." The official blinked its crystalline eyes in what might have been confusion, because no one had ever thanked it for performing such a low-status duty before. "Follow me," it said after a moment of hesitation, and then turned and walked quickly through the docking bay without looking back to see if Marcus was keeping up. They traveled through a maze of corridors and transit tubes that seemed to go on forever, passing through sections of the station where dozens of different species lived and worked and argued. Marcus tried to memorize every turn, every species he saw, every detail of this incredible place that would be his home for however long it took. His quarters turned out to be a small room at the far edge of the station, with a single window that looked out at the cold stars and furniture that had clearly been designed for a species with very different proportions than humans. Meal dispensers are programmed with basic human nutritional requirements. The official said, "Council sessions begin at 600-hour station time, and you may observe from the balcony on level 47, but you are not permitted to speak or interact with delegates." During official proceedings, Marcus nodded and thanked the official again. And this time, the Kovathi paused at the door and turned back with something like curiosity in its glowing eyes. "Why are you here?" it asked. "Your species was rejected, and you have no power to change that decision. So what do you hope to accomplish by sitting in a room and watching?" Marcus set down his leather satchel and looked at the alien with genuine warmth in his eyes. "I am here to learn," he said simply, "and maybe to share a little bit of who we are, because I think the council made their decision without really knowing us." The official made a sound that might have been a laugh and said, "The council has been making decisions about species for 50,000 years, and they do not make mistakes." Then it left. And Marcus was alone in his small room at the edge of the galaxy. He spent his first week simply watching and listening, sitting in the observer's balcony during council sessions and walking through the public areas of the station. During the hours between, he learned that the Kovathi controlled most of the political power through ancient treaties and military might. and that the Marathi Consortium dominated trade with their vast merchant fleets. He learned that they were artists and philosophers whose singing could move even the most hardened warriors to tears, and that the Vrelians were an insectoid species who maintained the station systems, but had no voice in council affairs. It was the Vrelians who first caught Marcus's attention, because everywhere he went he saw them working in the shadows, fixing pipes and cleaning floors and maintaining the machinery that kept 10 million beings alive. No one looked at them or spoke to them or even seemed to notice they existed. And Marcus found that very strange on his 8th day on the station. Marcus was walking through one of the lower market districts when he saw a Vrelian worker struggling to carry a heavy piece of equipment through a crowded corridor. The insectoid being was small, barely reaching Marcus's chest, with 4 arms and large compound eyes that reflected the lights of the market. Stalls around them, dozens of other species pushed past without offering to help, some even shoving the Vrelian aside to get where they were going fast. Marcus walked over and asked, "Can I help you with that?" The Vrelian froze and stared up at him with all 4 of its eyes, and for a long moment it seemed unable to understand what was happening. "You want to help me?" it asked in a clicking voice that the translator rendered as confused and suspicious. "If you would like," Marcus said. "That looks heavy, and I am not doing anything important." The Vrelian continued to stare, and then slowly, carefully, it allowed Marcus to take one end of the equipment while it held the other. They walked together through the corridor, and Marcus asked the Vrelian its name. "Crix," the worker said, still sounding uncertain. "My designation is Crix. Maintenance Unit 774. "It is nice to meet you, Crix," Marcus said. "My name is Marcus, and I am the human observer." They reached the maintenance access point where Crix needed to install the equipment, and Marcus helped lift it into place while other species walked past without a second glance. "Why did you help me?" Crix asked when they were finished. "No one helps Vrelians, and you are a human. Your species was rejected by the council." Marcus leaned against the wall and smiled at the small insectoid worker. "Where I come from, we try to help each other when we can," he said. "It does not matter who you are or where you come from. If someone needs help and you can give it, you should." Crix made a rapid clicking sound that Marcus would later learn was the Vrelian expression of deep thought. "I have worked on this station for 47 years, Crix said, "and no one has ever asked my name before." That simple statement hit Marcus harder than the council's rejection had hit the human delegation, and he felt a deep sadness for this small creature who had spent nearly 50 years being invisible. "Well, Crix," Marcus said, "I hope we can be friends over the following weeks." Marcus made it a habit to visit the maintenance levels and talk with the Vrelian workers. Learning about their culture and their families and their dreams, he discovered that they came from a world with 17 moons that created tides, so complex their cities had to float on the waters, and that they had songs they sang during their work that no other species had ever bothered to hear. He shared coffee with them, teaching them about the bitter drink that humans loved so much, and they shared their own beverages with him, strange glowing liquids that tasted like honey, and electricity. Word began to spread through the lower levels of the station about the strange human who treated workers like equals. Marcus also spent time in the observation balcony, watching the council conduct its business, and he began to notice patterns that the delegates themselves seemed blind to. He saw how the smaller species were always interrupted when they spoke, how their concerns were dismissed with polite words that meant nothing, how the real decisions were made in private meetings between the powerful few. He saw the Thesan delegate trying to propose a cultural exchange program and being ignored, saw the representative from a species of aquatic beings requesting aid for their dying oceans and receiving only empty promises, and he saw that beneath the gleaming surface of galactic civilization there was loneliness and fear and the desperate need for someone to simply listen. Marcus listened. He sat in the markets and asked merchants about their homeworlds, asked travelers about their journeys, asked anyone who would talk to him about their lives and their hopes and their sorrows. At first they were suspicious, wondering what the rejected human wanted from them. But when they realized he wanted nothing except to understand, something changed. They began to seek him out. These beings from 100 different worlds, finding the human observer in his small room or walking through the corridors, and they would talk for hours about things they had never told anyone. Marcus learned that the great and powerful Galactic Council was really just a collection of frightened beings trying to hold together a civilization that was slowly forgetting why it existed in the first place. He learned that beneath the contempt they showed for humanity, many species secretly envied the humans for their passion and their unity and their stubborn refusal to accept that anything was impossible. And he learned that kindness, simple human kindness, was something the galaxy had forgotten long ago. 3 months after his arrival, Marcus Cole was no longer invisible. He had made friends in every level of the station, from the forgotten Vrelian workers to the lonely merchants to the junior delegates who were tired of being ignored by their superiors. He had not asked for power or demanded respect or complained about his treatment. He had simply been himself, a human being who cared about others, and that had been enough to plant seeds of change throughout Nexus Prime. The Council still did not take him seriously, still saw him as nothing more than a curiosity from a rejected species. But in the shadows of the station, in the maintenance tunnels, in the market stalls, and the quiet corners where no one important ever went, something was growing, and Marcus Cole knew that when the time came, those seeds would bloom into something the galaxy had never seen before. If you jettison this section, you will be killing 4,000 beings who trusted you to protect them, and you will be proving that all your tall. If you jettison this section, you will be killing 4,000 beings who trusted you to protect them, and you will be proving that all your asterisk. 2 weeks had passed since the quarantine barriers came down, and Marcus Cole sat in the medical bay where doctors from 6 different species had been monitoring his health around the clock. He had somehow avoided infection during those 11 terrible days, a miracle that the physicians attributed to a combination of luck, proper containment procedures, and what one Thiessen healer called the stubbornness of human biology. The burns on his hands from handling contaminated materials were healing slowly, and the nightmares that woke him every few hours were becoming less frequent. But the weight of the 800 he could not save still pressed heavy on his heart. Soft chime at the door announced a visitor, and Marcus looked up to see Ambassador Thelvan standing in the entrance, his crystalline body catching the medical bay lights in ways that made him look almost hesitant. Human Observer Cole, the Korvathi said formally, "The Council has requested your presence in the main chamber." Marcus felt a flicker of surprise at this unexpected summons, because in all his months on Nexus Prime, the Council had never acknowledged his existence beyond the initial assignment of his quarters. "Am I in trouble?" he asked. Only half joking, Thelvan was silent for a moment. And then he did something that Marcus had never seen a Korvathi do before. He looked away, unable to meet the human's eyes. "The Council wishes to discuss the events of the quarantine," the ambassador said finally. "There are matters that require your testimony." Marcus, dressed in clean clothes that Crix had brought him from his quarters, and followed Talvan through the corridors of Nexus Prime. Everywhere they went, beings of every species stopped what they were doing to watch the human pass. And Marcus noticed something different in their expressions now, something that had not been there before. There was no contempt, no amusement, no dismissal. Instead, he saw respect and wonder, and something that looked almost like hope. The main council chamber was fuller than Marcus had ever seen it. with every seat occupied and crowds of observers filling the galleries above as he walked down the central aisle toward the small platform reserved for speakers. The chamber fell into a silence so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat. Ambassador Thelvan took his place at the high podium and addressed the assembly. This session has been called to discuss the crisis in Section 12 and the actions taken during the quarantine period. He announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the massive room. Before we proceed with standard testimony, there is a matter of unusual protocol that must be addressed, Thelvan continued. And something in his tone made the other delegates lean forward with curiosity. A request has been made for a non-delegate to address this council. A request that has no precedent in 50,000 years of recorded proceedings. Murmurs rippled through the chamber as delegates turned to look at each other in confusion. The request comes from the Vrelian Collective, Thelvan said. And now the murmurs became gasps of shock. The Vrelians had no voice in council affairs, had never been permitted to speak in this chamber, had been treated as invisible servants for longer than most species could remember. A small figure emerged from the workers' entrance at the side of the chamber, and Marcus felt his heart swell with pride as he recognized Crix walking slowly toward the speaker's platform. The little Vrelian climbed the steps and stood before the most powerful beings in the galaxy, her forearms trembling slightly, but her compound eyes steady and determined. I am Crix. Maintenance Unit 774, she said, her clicking voice amplified by the chamber's systems. I have worked on this station for 47 years. And in all that time, I have never spoken to anyone who was not giving me orders. She paused and looked directly at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. Then the human came. Crix continued. He was rejected by this council, told that his species was not worthy of a place among you, and he was sent to a small room at the edge of the station where no one important ever went. The chamber was absolutely silent as the Vrelian workers spoke words that had never been spoken in this place. But he did not act like someone who had been rejected. Crix said he did not hide in his room and feel sorry for himself. And he did not spend his time trying to convince the powerful to change their minds. Instead, he came to the maintenance levels and talked to us, the Vrelians who keep this station running, but who no one ever sees. She continued. He asked our names. He learned about our families. He shared his strange bitter drink with us and laughed at our jokes. Crix's voice grew stronger as she spoke, filled with emotion that clicked and hummed through the translation systems. When the plague ship crashed, the council decided to abandon 4,000 beings to die. But the human did not agree with that decision. She said, he walked into the quarantine zone knowing he would probably die. And do you know what he said to me when I asked why? She looked around the chamber at the assembled delegates, these powerful beings who had ruled the galaxy for millennia. He said that where he comes from, they try to help each other when they can, that it does not matter who you are or where you come from. If someone needs help and you can get it, you should. Crix pointed at Marcus with one of her forearms. This human treated me with more respect in our first conversation than I have received in 47 years on this station. She said, he taught us how to save lives during the quarantine. He held the hands of the dying. He organized us into teams that accomplished what your council said was impossible. I am not asking you to give humanity a seat on this council. Crix concluded. I am asking you to look at what one of them did when everything fell apart, and then ask yourselves what that says about the decision you made. She stepped down from the platform and walked back toward the workers' entrance. But before she reached it, the Thesan delegate rose from her seat. I would also like to speak, the Thesan said. Her musical voice filling the chamber. Ambassador Thelvan looked uncertain, but nodded for her to continue. During the quarantine, Human Observer Cole broadcast medical information on open channels that anyone could access. The Thesan said, That information saved my daughter on a colony world 300 light years from here, where a variant of the same virus had begun to spread. She turned to look at the other delegates with eyes that shimmered with unshed tears. The human did not know my daughter existed, did not know that his words would reach across the stars to save her. But he shared his knowledge freely because he thought it might help someone somewhere. Another delegate rose. This one, a massive being from the Gorath Confederacy, whose species was known for their martial traditions. My cousin was trapped in the quarantine zone. The Gorath said in a rumbling voice. He told me that when the human first arrived and began organizing the response, many did not trust him because he was from a rejected species. The Gorath delegate looked at Marcus with something approaching admiration. My cousin said that the human did not argue or demand respect. He simply started helping and let his actions speak for themselves. And within hours, everyone in that section would have followed him anywhere, one by one. Delegates from species across the galaxy rose to share their own stories, and Marathi merchants spoke of how Marcus had helped him carry supplies during the crisis even, though the merchant had mocked humans in the pasta. Representative from a species of aquatic beings described how the human observer had spent hours learning about their dying oceans and had promised to share their story with Earth scientists. A young delegate from a minor species talked about how Marcus had been the first person on the entire station to ask about their homeworld and actually listen to the answer. The testimonies continued for hours, painting a picture of a human who had spent his time on Nexus Prime not seeking power or demanding respect, but simply connecting with others and treating them with basic kindness. When the last speaker had finished, Ambassador Thelvan looked at Marcus with an expression that was difficult to read on his crystalline face. Human Observer Cole, he said, do you have anything to say in response to these testimonies? Marcus stood slowly and walked to the speaker's platform, feeling the weight of 1,000 alien eyes upon him. Thought about everything that had happened since he arrived on this station, about the friends he had made and the lives he had saved and the 800 he could know. Thought about Earth, about the billions of humans who were watching this broadcast and wondering what their representative would say to the beings who had rejected them. And he thought about why he had come here in the first place. When I was a young man, I was a teacher, Marcus began, his voice quiet but clear. I taught history to children who were just learning about the world. And the hardest part of that job was explaining why humans had done so many terrible things to each other. He looked around the chamber at the assembled delegates. The wars, the genocides, the slavery, the destruction. He continued, our history is filled with horrors that no species should be proud of. And when you rejected humanity for our violent past, you were not wrong. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the chamber at this unexpected admission. But you only saw half of our story, Marcus said. You saw the darkness without seeing the light that came after it. The applause continued for what felt like hours. Wave after wave of clicking and humming and singing and stamping that filled the great chamber with a sound unlike anything heard in its 50,000 years of history. Marcus Cole stood on the speaker's platform and felt the vibrations of that sound move through his body. And he wondered if Earth could hear it too, if the billions of humans watching from so far away could feel this moment the way he did. Ambassador Thelvan raised his crystalline hand and slowly, gradually, the chamber fell silent once more. The Kovati leader looked out at the assembled delegates, at the species who had ruled the galaxy together for millennia, and Marcus could see that something had changed in his ancient eyes. In all my years serving this council, I have never witnessed what has occurred in this chamber today, Thelvan said, his voice heavy with a weight that had not been there before. I have seen empires rise and fall, seen species join our ranks and others destroy themselves, seen every kind of political maneuver and diplomatic strategy that the galaxy has to offer. He continued, but I have never seen a single individual, with no power and no weapons and no demands, accomplish what this human has accomplished. He turned to face Marcus directly, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, softer somehow, as if the crystal that formed his body had been reshaped by what he had witnessed when humanity petitioned for membership. I was among those who argued most strongly for rejection, Thelvan admitted. I looked at your history and saw only violence, looked at your technology and saw only primitives, looked at your small territory and saw only insignificance. The chamber was absolutely silent as the most powerful being in the galaxy made this confession. I was wrong, Thelvan said simply. I judged your species by the worst of your past without seeing the best of your present. And in doing so I failed in my duty to this council and to the principles upon which it was founded. He stepped down from the high podium and walked toward Marcus, his footsteps echoing through the stunned silence. Human Observer Cole, he said, stopping directly in front of Marcus. On behalf of the Galactic Council, I offer an apology for the manner in which your species was treated, and for the arrogance that led us to believe we knew you when we did not. Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat as he looked at the ancient Kovathi standing before him with something like humility in his glowing eyes. No apology is necessary. Ambassador, Marcus said quietly, you made the best decision you could with the information you had, and I cannot fault anyone for trying to protect their civilization. Thelvan made a sound that might have been a laugh, though it was hard to tell with Kovathi expressions. Even now, after everything we did to your species, you respond with grace, the ambassador said. I begin to understand why Crix and the others spoke so highly of you. He turned back to face the assembled council. I have served on this body for 900 years, Thelvan announced, and in all that time I have never invoked the protocol of exceptional recognition. Murmurs spread through the chamber as delegates who remembered their ancient history realized what the Kovathi was proposing. This protocol exists for moments when conventional procedures are insufficient to address an extraordinary situation, Thelvan continued. It allows the Council to grant immediate membership to a species without the standard review period, by unanimous vote of all member species. He looked around the chamber at the 347 delegations that represented the full scope of galactic civilization. I propose that we invoke this protocol now, for the species known as humanity, Thelvan said. All those in favor? For a heartbeat. Nothing happened, and the Thyssen delegate rose from her seat and spoke the word of agreement in her musical voice. The Gorath representative followed, his rumbling tone filling the chamber one by one. Delegation after delegation stood and added their voices. Species that had competed and cooperated, and sometimes fought each other for thousands of years, all speaking the same word. Marcus watched in disbelief as beings from every corner of the galaxy declared their support. As the count climbed higher and higher until finally the last delegation, a species of living crystal from the distant rim worlds, added their shimmering tones to the chorus. 347 specious inanimals turned back to Marcus with something that might have been a smile on his fasted face. It is done, he said. Humanity is now a full member of the Galactic Council, with all the rights and responsibilities that come with that position. The chamber erupted once more into celebration, and Marcus found himself surrounded by delegates who wanted to shake his hand or touch his shoulder or simply stand near him. But through the crowd he saw Crix and the other Vrelian workers watching from the edge of the chamber, and he gently pushed through the throng of well-wishers to reach his friends. We did it, Crix said, her 4 eyes shimmering with moisture that Marcus had learned was the Vrelian equivalent of joyful tears. You did it! We did it together, Marcus corrected her. I could not have survived that first week without you and the others showing me how this station really works." The celebration continued around them. But then, a group of workers appeared carrying something large covered in shimmering fabric. Ambassador Thelvan's voice cut through the noise, calling for attention once more. "It is tradition that new member species are presented with a ceremonial seat, designed to honor their unique characteristics and contributions," he announced. The workers pulled away the fabric to reveal a magnificent throne made of woven light. Strands of every color in the spectrum, twisted together into patterns that seemed to move and dance. It was beautiful. The kind of artifact that artists would study for centuries. And it had clearly been created with great care and respect. Marcus looked at the throne for a long moment. And then he shook his head. "I am honored by this gift," he said, "but I cannot accept it." Confused murmurs rippled through the chamber as delegates wondered if the human was refusing membership. After all, Marcus walked toward the throne and ran his fingers along the glowing strands. "This is the seat of an empire, a throne for rulers and conquerors," he said. "And that is not what humanity came here to be." He turned to face the assembly. "We did not earn our place on this council through military might or economic power or political maneuvering," Marcus said. "We earned it by treating a maintenance worker as an equal, by sharing coffee with people who had never been offered kindness, by running into a quarantine zone because we could not stand by while others died." He gestured toward Crix and the Relian workers who had carried the throne into the chamber. "These are the people who keep your civilization running," Marcus said. "They maintain your systems and clean your floors and fix your ships. And most of you do not even know their names." He looked at Crix with a warmth that needed no translation. "If humanity is going to have a seat on this council, I want it to be the same as everyone else's," Marcus said. "No throne, no special honors. Just a chair at the table where we can work alongside our new partners as equals." He paused and added, "And I want the Vrelians to have a seat too." The chamber fell into stunned silence. The Vrelians had never had representation on the council, had never been considered worthy of a voice in galactic affairs. Ambassador Thelvan looked at Marcus for a long moment, and then he turned to face the assembly. "The human makes a request that has no precedent," he said. "But then, nothing about humanity has followed precedent since they first arrived at this station." He looked at Crix, who stood frozen in shock at what Marcus had proposed. "The Vrelian Collective has served this station faithfully for 12,000 years," Thelvan said. "They have never asked for recognition, never demanded rights, never complained about their treatment. Perhaps that is precisely why they deserve a seat." He concluded, "I move that the Vrelian Collective be granted observer status, with the possibility of full membership to be reviewed at the next standard session." The vote was not unanimous this time, but it was overwhelming. And when it was done, Crix stood beside Marcus as the first Vrelian ever recognized by the Galactic Council across the galaxy. Billions of beings watched the broadcast as two unlikely allies, a human and an insectoid worker, stood together in the great chamber and represented something that the council had forgotten was possible. The celebrations continued late into the station's artificial night, and Marcus found himself passed from group to group as species after species wanted to meet the human who had changed everything. But eventually, he slipped away from the crowds and made his way to an observation deck near the outer rim of the station, where he could look out at the stars. And Peace Earth was out there somewhere, a small blue dot in a galaxy of wonders. And he thought about everyone back home who had believed in him when no one else did. Director Vasquez, who had proposed sending a single envoy when the rest of the world wanted to rage or retreat. His sister, who had hugged him at the shuttle and whispered that she knew he would make them proud. The children in his classroom so many years ago, who had asked him why humans did terrible things and had accepted his answer, that people could always choose to be better. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Crix approaching, her forearms carrying 2 containers. "I brought coffee," the Vrelian said. "I know you humans love this strange bitter."